I saw a knitting comb in the craft store the other day. It was between $15 and $20, and it was beautiful tropical hardwoods, so really a lovely tool. But it reminded me that one can knit on any wide-tooth comb as long as the teeth are smooth enough and widely spaced. Here's one I bought years and years ago from the dollar store. Let's see how it works. Okie dokie, let's see how this is going to work. Going to start as usual with a little loop, a slip knot, and I'm going to E-wrap each one of the tines on this comb. I'm going to keep it loose because I think that we will need the play in the yarn to lift over the tines. Okay, that's all E-wrapped. Now I'm going to go back and E-wrap everything again. The first one in the same direction, but after that I'll need to reverse my E-wraps, making backwards letter E's. All the way across. It's called an E-wrap because you are making the cursive letter E shape with the yarn. Just in case you didn't know, that'll help you to visualize. Okay. Now I'm going to use the normal loom tool available for nifty knitters. This one is actually from an authentic knitting board. And lift the lower E-wrap over and to the other side of each tine, including the upper E-wrap, and try not to drop any. I got a little piece of thread in the act. Okay, that should be one row of knitting. Actually, my last E-wrap came undone. Let me fix it. There we go. Now these are all true stitches. Now this time in every other row we only have to make a single row of E-wraps because we've already cast on. Our first row of E-wraps was the cast on. Our second row was actual stitches. And I like to start with the last stitch first because that locks your stitches into place. Now all these other E-wraps don't want to go anywhere, but previously they would have liked to unwind. It's okay if your stitch slides up the tine while you work, but don't let it fall off of the tine, and don't let it split the yarn as that one tried to do. I mean, don't let the tine split the yarn. Let me show you. If I do this, it will make a mess later. So make sure that the entire loop of yarn goes over the tine. Now this is stockinette knitting, one-sided, normal stockinette. Actually, this is E-wrap stockinette. There is another kind. E-wrap stockinette will show slight twists on the knit side. It will also roll on the edges. So if you want this to be a flat piece of knitting, you'll have to do something to finish the edges, such as crochet. Now let's wrap back. I'm going to hold this a little bit differently. Okay. I did reverse E-wraps all the way across to keep things from falling off, and starting with the final stitch, I'm knitting each one over. And after this, we'll just go back and forth like we have been doing until the piece of knitting is the same length that we want it to be. So what could you do with a comb knitted piece? It's not very big. You could make a belt. You could make a tie, a headband, something to hold your keys. See the knitting developing? We're looking at the purl side. There's the knit side. You can begin to see what I mean by the twists that an E-wrap stitch makes. What I'm using here is Jiffy yarn, which I thought would be compatible with the size of the tines and the spacing of the tines. And so far I think that that decision was accurate. Let me try holding it in yet another direction so you get another angle of view. Now, just in case you wanted to know, the next row I'm going to attempt to knit with the flat stitch, which does not have a twist in it. And the reason I say attempt is the flat stitch tends to be tighter than the E-wrap stitch, and I'm not sure whether it's suitable to comb knitting. In the flat stitch, we don't loop it around with an E-wrap. We simply bring the yarn across in front of the tine and lift the previous stitch over. Now, I know from experience we need to tug down to loosen the stitch. I'm tugging there. Otherwise, the following row will get just too difficult to knit. This stitch, the flat stitch, what I'm actually doing, some people would call the U stitch, because I am causing the yarn to make a U shape around this tine by lifting the previous stitch over and pulling down. And now you can see my yarn has encircled the tine with the letter U. This stitch will be much closer to identical to hand-knitted stockinette, for better or worse. There's nothing morally superior about one over the other. They're just different, and sometimes hand knitters purposely knit twisted stitches. So it isn't really different, it's just that the most common hand knitting stitch is this plain stockinette stitch, and in loom knitting I would say that the E-wrap stitch is more common. There you see it forming. And it's not too early to tell. Look, the previous row, see how the bottoms of the stitches cross one another? And on the just knitted row, you can see they're more open. They're not going to do it. Let's knit an additional row of flat stitch. Then you'll get a better look. The very first stitch is a little bit difficult for me, especially trying to keep my hand out of the way of the camera. Pulling down. In fact, pulling down a little more. Well, what do you know? Flat stitch works just fine, or as long as you make it a U-like flat stitch. You can start to see the difference, though. Look, these are the purl bumps that my thumb's running along. Let me run the tool along them. Those are called the purl bumps. The distance between the rows of purl bumps where I was knitting the E-wrap stitch seems to be greater than the distance of these flat stitch rows. And that's what you'd expect, even with me loosening up the stitch by tugging. It will be probably a little bit tighter. So why would you want to do this? Well, it's pretty easy to keep a comb in your pocket and a little bit of yarn so that if you're stuck waiting in line somewhere, you're not bored stupid. A little easier to keep around than knitting needles. Fun to teach a child while you wait, or a bored adult. And of course you get the knitting. While you weren't looking, I knitted a few more rows, and now you can clearly see that it's a little bit tighter for the rows that were not twisted, and you can see the slightly different look. A V where the points just touch versus a V where they overlap one another slightly. Now I thought you might like to bind off with me. I'm sure there's more than one way, but here's the way that I think will be easiest. I'm going to transfer stitch 1 to stitch 2, make another wrap, knit both stitches off. Now move stitch 2 to stitch 3, which is a brand new loop. Make another wrap, knit them both off, and so on across. This should make an edge that looks like a little bit of a chain stitch and does not get overly tight. And we can see it starting here. Let's do one more like that, and then I'm going to bind off the rest in an alternate way. Let's try this. Transfer one loop backwards, knit it over, move it ahead. Transfer the next loop backwards, knit the bottom loop over, move the existing loop ahead. Transfer backwards, knit the bottom loop over, move it on. This is also making a chain stitch, but because there's not extra yarn involved, it's a little bit tighter. So it depends on the texture of your knitting and what you're aiming for, which one you want to do. They're both pretty easy, and the look is similar but not identical. Now for my last loop, I don't have scissors handy, but I would need to use a piece of yarn and tie this off. You don't want to end up with a piece of yarn in the middle of the row like this, and the only reason I did is because I changed methods. Normally, I could have started the second kind of bind off from the opposite end of the yarn tail and transfer, make stitches and pull the yarn tail through the final loop. Or I could have done the first kind of bind off all the way across. My yarn tail would end up over here where it belongs, and I would have pulled it through the final loop. So this is a feature of simply showing you two things in one row. But there you go. A little comb knitted piece of knitting. As a matter of fact, if you made that one just a little bit bigger, it could be a coaster. Right now it's a tad skimpy, but a few more rows and it would have done the job. And if you didn't want it to roll at all on the edges, you would either crochet around it or simply knit it double and sew it flat. So if I had, what did I knit? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think 16 rows would have made a better size. So if I knitted 32, I could have then folded them in half, sewn the edges together, and had a doubled coaster. Happy knitting. Bye now.